What if I told you that looking poor made China rich? That appearing weak was actually their greatest strength? And that while America celebrated victory, China was quietly winning a war most people didn't even know was being fought? Before we dig into one of the most brilliant economic strategies of the last 50 years, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to learn isn't taught in schools, and it changes everything you thought you knew about money and power. Here's what most people believe. Strong countries have strong currencies, and weak countries have worthless money. It's drilled into us, the mighty dollar, the powerful pound. When a currency crashes, we assume the nation behind it is failing. But what if that entire framework is backwards? What if making your currency look weak isn't a disaster, but a carefully calculated move? What if devaluation isn't surrender, but strategy? China proved this exact point. For more than 3 decades, they purposely kept their currency, the yuan, artificially cheap. Not because their economy was collapsing, not because they didn't know what they were doing, but because weakness was the disguise for one of the most aggressive economic takeovers in human history. And while the West was busy congratulating itself on cheap televisions and abundant consumer goods, China was building an empire. Let me show you how they did it. To understand this strategy, we have to rewind to the late 1970s. Picture China back then. The country had just crawled out from under the chaos of Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution. Cities were broken. The economy was isolated from the world. Factories were outdated, sometimes non-existent. Millions lived in poverty. China wasn't a player on the global stage. It was barely holding itself together. Then came a man named Deng Xiaoping. In 1978, Deng launched a series of economic reforms that cracked open China's doors to the rest of the world. He invited foreign companies to invest. He allowed private businesses to operate. He set up special economic zones along the coast where capitalism could experiment freely. The message was clear. China was open for business. But there was a massive problem. How do you compete globally when you're decades behind? When your technology is primitive, when nobody trusts your products, when established players like Japan, Germany, and the United States already dominate manufacturing? China's answer was brutally simple. Make your products so cheap that nobody can say no. And the easiest, fastest way to make everything you sell cheaper is to manipulate your currency. Now this is where most documentaries lose people. They start throwing around terms like foreign exchange interventions and purchasing power parity, and your eyes glaze over. So let's strip this down to the bone. Imagine you run a lemonade stand. In a fair market, your lemonade costs $1. But your competitor down the street also charges $1, and their lemonade tastes better because they've been perfecting the recipe for years. You can't win on quality yet, so what do? You drop your price to 50 cents. Suddenly, even though your lemonade isn't as good, people flock to you because it's half the price. Your competitor can't match that without going broke. So slowly, customers stop going to them. They shut down, and now you own the neighborhood. Once they're gone, you can raise your prices again. You sacrificed short-term profit to win long-term dominance. That's exactly what China did with its currency, but on a global scale. Let's say, in a free and open market, the yuan should trade at 5 yuan per US dollar. If China's exports start booming, demand for yuan goes up, and the currency naturally gets stronger. Maybe it moves to 4 yuan per dollar. That makes Chinese products more expensive for Americans to buy, which slows down exports. But China didn't want that. So the People's Bank of China, the country's central bank, stepped in and said, no, we're keeping it at 8 yuan per dollar. They artificially held the currency weak. How? Every time dollars poured into China from export sales, the central bank bought those dollars and sold yuan. They essentially printed more yuan to flood the market, keeping it cheap. Those dollars they bought, they stacked them up in foreign reserves. By the year 2014, China had accumulated nearly $4 trillion in reserves. 4 trillion. That's not a typo. That's the size of entire economies. The result of this strategy was devastating for competitors. Chinese goods stayed dirt cheap on the global market. A television that should have cost $300 could sell for $150. Clothing, electronics, toys, furniture, you name it, all radically underpriced. American consumers thought they were getting a great deal, and technically they were, but they didn't see the trap being set. Through the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s, this strategy turbocharged China's rise. Factories sprouted like weeds in cities along the coast: Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Shanghai. These places transformed from fishing villages and quiet towns into roaring industrial hubs. Global companies like Apple, Nike, and Walmart moved their production to China. Why wouldn't they? Labor was cheap, the currency was cheap, profits soared. China's trade surplus, the difference between what it exported and what it imported, exploded. The country was selling way more than it was buying, and all those surplus dollars flowed back into the Chinese central bank. But here's the twist that most people miss. China didn't just hoard those dollars, they lent them back to the United States by buying U.S. Treasury bonds. In other words, China sold America cheap goods, then turned around and financed America's debt with the same money. Think about the irony. American consumers bought Chinese products with borrowed money. That money went to China. China then lent it back to the U.S. government. America got deeper in debt. China got richer and more powerful. And the whole time, Americans thought they were winning because their shopping carts were full. This is the part where Western thinking completely failed. In the United States and Europe, a strong currency is a point of pride. Politicians brag about it: the strong dollar, the mighty euro. It's treated like a reflection of national strength, a scoreboard of success. So when China's currency stayed weak, Western economists looked down on it. They saw it as proof that China was still a developing nation, still inferior, still playing catch-up. But that condescension was exactly what Beijing wanted. Because while the West was distracted by the symbolism of currency strength, China was focused on the substance of industrial power. A weak yuan wasn't a sign of failure. It was a tool, a weapon. By keeping the yuan cheap, China bought time. Time to build factories, time to develop infrastructure, time to train a skilled workforce, time to pull hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Time to become indispensable. And it worked. By the early 2000s, China wasn't just a low-cost manufacturer. It was the backbone of global supply chains. If you wanted electronics, you needed China. If you wanted textiles, you needed China. If you wanted steel, rare earth metals, solar panels, you needed China. The leverage had shifted. Of course, once people in Washington and Brussels figured out what was happening, they weren't happy. Politicians started screaming about currency manipulation. They demanded that China let the yuan rise to its real value. Trade disputes broke out. Threats of tariffs flew back and forth. And yes, technically, China was manipulating its currency. But calling it manipulation makes it sound illegal or sneaky, like cheating at poker. In reality, it was just geopolitics. Every country plays these games. The United States prints dollars to maintain global dominance. Euro manages the euro to balance the interests of multiple nations. Japan intervened in currency markets for decades to boost exports. China's crime wasn't manipulation, it was being too good at it. But while Western leaders complained, their own economies were becoming hollowed out. Manufacturing jobs disappeared. Factories in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, the industrial heartland of America, shut down. Entire towns were gutted. The middle class shrank. Meanwhile, Chinese cities gleamed with new skyscrapers, high-speed trains, and modern ports. The cheap yuan had done its job. By the mid-2000s, something interesting happened. China started loosening its grip on the yuan. In 2005, Beijing allowed the currency to appreciate gradually. The exchange rate started moving closer to what the market would naturally set. Why? Because the mission was complete. China no longer needed a dirt-cheap currency to dominate exports. It already owned the factories, the supply chains, the infrastructure, the expertise. The leverage was baked into the system.
The weak yuan had been a ladder. Once China climbed to the top, it could afford to let the ladder fall. By 2016, the International Monetary Fund added the yuan to its basket of global reserve currencies, alongside the dollar, euro, pound, and yen. It was a symbolic coronation. China was no longer just a factory, it was a financial power. But don't think the strategy disappeared. It just evolved. Today, China applies the same playbook to entire industries. Take electric vehicles. Chinese companies like BYD are flooding global markets with EVs priced so low that Western automakers can't compete. How? Massive state subsidies. The Chinese government props up these companies, allowing them to sell cars at a loss if necessary. The goal isn't immediate profit.
The goal is to crush the competition and dominate the industry. Once Western car companies collapse or retreat, China controls the future of transportation. Same story with solar panels. China produces them cheaper than anyone else, not because they've discovered some magic efficiency, but because the government subsidizes production. They flood the market, bankrupt competitors in Europe and America, and then own the supply chain. Steel, batteries, semiconductors. The sectors change, but the logic stays the same. Sacrifice short-term profit, win long-term control. And Western governments are scrambling. The United States, Canada, and the European Union are slapping heavy tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and solar panels, claiming unfair competition. But it's too late. The damage is done. The factories are already built. The expertise is already there. The supply chains are already locked in. China played the long game, and the long game wins. But here's where it gets even more interesting. China isn't just trying to dominate industries. It wants to challenge the US dollar itself. Right now, the dollar is the world's reserve currency. Oil is traded in dollars. International debts are settled in dollars. Countries hold dollars as their main reserve. This gives the United States enormous power. It can print money and export inflation. It can impose sanctions that cripple entire nations. It can borrow almost infinitely because everyone needs dollars. China wants to break that monopoly. That's why Beijing is pushing countries to trade in yuan. It's signing oil contracts with Middle Eastern nations denominated in yuan, not dollars. It's lending money to developing countries through the Belt and Road Initiative in yuan. It's developing a digital yuan to leapfrog traditional banking systems and give the Chinese state direct control over transactions. If the yuan becomes a true alternative to the dollar, the global balance of power shifts. America loses its financial leverage. China gains it. And once again, the strategy relies on patience. You don't overthrow the dollar in 5 years. You chip away at it over decades. You build alternatives. You create dependencies. You wait. So here's the bottom line, the lesson that cuts through all the economics jargon and political noise. A weak currency doesn't mean a weak country. Sometimes it means a smart country. China sacrificed the prestige of a strong yuan to gain the substance of real power. It traded symbolic strength for actual dominance. It made itself look poor to become rich. It played weak to become strong. And while Western leaders were admiring their own reflections in the mirror of a strong currency, China was building the future. The United States got cheap goods and mounting debt. China got factories, infrastructure, and leverage. Who really won? This isn't new, by the way. History is full of examples. Ancient Rome debased its currency, mixing cheap metals into coins to stretch its empire further. Spain flooded Europe with silver from the New World to fund its wars and colonies. The United States prints dollars to maintain its military and economic dominance worldwide. Different eras, different tools, same principle. Money is never neutral. It's always a weapon. And those who understand that best are the ones who win. China understood. It devalued the yuan not out of weakness, but out of ruthless strategic clarity. And that single decision reshaped the world. The next time you hear someone talk about currency strength, remember this story. Remember that the numbers on an exchange rate board don't tell you who's winning. They tell you who's playing the game better. China kept the yuan weak for 30 years.
and in doing so, built one of the most powerful economies in human history. It pulled hundreds of millions out of poverty. It became the center of global manufacturing. It positioned itself to challenge American dominance, all because it understood a truth the West ignored. If this changed how you see money and power, hit that subscribe button. Because here at Monetary Archaeologist, we dig up the truths that history buries and the lessons that money teaches. The past holds the answers. I'll keep showing you where to look.